Welcome to The Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by R.J. Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
Usually, when we think about how we navigate the world, we imagine our minds picking up tools.
Right, like grabbing a wrench when you need to fix a pipe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You walk into a new job or, a new relationship, and you pick up the tool of evaluation. You figure out what you're dealing with, get a lay of the land, and then you put the tool down.
You assess the room, find your seat, and just, why don't you just relax into the experience of being there?
Yeah, because the evaluation has a definitive endpoint. But think about what happens if you literally can't put that tool down. What if that act of evaluating, of constantly judging, stops being a temporary action and actually becomes the architecture of who you are?
It's kind of like replacing your eyes with a flashlight.
Oh, I like that. How so?
Well, you initially turn the flashlight on just to avoid tripping over the coffee table in the dark, right?
Mm-hmm.
But eventually it becomes the only way you see anything permanently. Every single object, every person, every conversation just becomes a target for the beam.
You can never just take in the whole room. You're perpetually scanning, highlighting, and identifying flaws.
Exactly. You lose the capacity for passive vision.
Which brings us to the source material for today's deep dive. We are looking at Professor R.J. Starr's work today because it, honestly, completely rewrites how we understand judgmental people.
It really does. It shifts the entire paradigm.
Yeah, because it's not a moral flaw. It's an architectural trap. His scholarly essay is called The Psychology of Judgment, when evaluation becomes the structure of the self. And it just strips away all the usual moral baggage we carry around this topic.
And that's what makes Starr's framework so refreshing. We aren't going to sit here and talk about whether being judgmental is, good or bad.
Right. No self-help advice today.
No, not at all.
Right.
We're looking at this like engineers examining a bridge. We want to know how this psychological system is built, what forces it's designed to withstand, and what physically happens to the materials over time.
Which requires a completely mechanistic perspective. Starr is a theorist in this field known as psychological architecture. It's a framework that examines how the mind, emotion, identity, and meaning interact structurally.
Right. And he argues that when evaluation takes over the entire operating system of a human psyche, it stops being about what the person is thinking. It starts being about how their psychological house is physically constructed.
To anchor that entirely, Starr provides one governing diagnostic claim for the essay. We should probably establish that right now.
Yeah, we definitely need to. Everything we discuss today is going to be an unpacking of this single sentence. He writes, "The system becomes increasingly coherent by becoming increasingly difficult to update."
The system becomes increasingly coherent by becoming increasingly difficult to update. I mean, that is dense.
It is incredibly dense, yeah.
But it perfectly sets the stakes for us. We are looking at what happens when an operating system becomes incredibly stable, but completely loses its ability to download new software.
That's a great way to frame it.
To even begin understanding how a mind gets to that point, I think we have to look at how Starr separates two concepts we normally lump together: discernment and judgment.
Right, because structurally, he says they are completely different animals.
So what's the core difference there?
The difference lies entirely in the off switch. Discernment is a highly functional cognitive capacity. You engage it when it's required.
Give me an example of that.
Let's say you're reviewing a dense legal contract, or you're deciding whether to trust a new vendor at your company. You fire up your evaluative processing. You look for flaws, risks, misalignments.
You're being highly critical, but on purpose.
Exactly. But crucially, when the meeting is over, you suspend that process. You go home, you play with your kids, you watch a movie. You aren't running that same risk assessment algorithm on your toddler's finger painting.
Right. You aren't looking at the painting and saying, well, the structural integrity of this house you drew is fundamentally flawed.
Exactly. The evaluative process is available to you, but it doesn't govern you. You control the switch.
Judgment, on the other hand, is what happens when that off switch physically disappears from the control panel.
Right. It's evaluation that has mutated from a subsystem into the primary operating system.
But that raises a massive mechanistic question for me. Why does the switch disappear? I mean, a brain doesn't just forget how to turn off a highly taxing cognitive process, right?
No, it doesn't.
Because running that flashlight 24/7 requires immense caloric and psychological energy. It should be exhausting.
It would be incredibly exhausting unless that energy expenditure was suddenly a matter of psychological survival.
Wait, survival?
Yeah. Starr's profound insight here is that the off switch doesn't vanish because of a bad habit. It disappears because the active evaluation gets recruited to do a completely different critical job: identity stabilization.
Identity stabilization. Wow, so the evaluation is no longer about the outside world at all.
No, not at all.
It's about holding the internal self together.
Exactly. Think about the fundamental architecture of a self. For most people, identity is somewhat fluid. It's sustained by a variety of pillars, relationships, passions, a sense of belonging, personal history.
Archetypal load-bearing wall.
Right. But if a psychological system organizes itself around evaluation, the continuous appraisal of the outside world becomes the central load-bearing pillar. It keeps the internal self in a recognizable shape.
So the act of constantly judging what is out there defines the borders of what is in here.
Exactly that. It's defining the self by negative space.
I am the person who sees that this is incorrect. Or, I am the person who knows that this movie is flawed. I'm the person who recognizes that this political take is garbage.
Yes. And if that becomes your primary mechanism for knowing who you are, then asking you to just turn off the judgment for an afternoon isn't just a request to relax.
Right. It's a structural threat.
It is an absolute existential threat to the architecture. If the appraisal stops, the structure of the self literally begins to loop coherence. The borders blur.
And the system starts to experience this terrifying sensation of collapse. So the machine keeps running, not because the person is, naturally mean-spirited.
Right, it's not malice.
It's because turning it off feels like psychological death.
That reframes the entire experience of being around someone like this, doesn't it?
It really does. When you tell a friend or a partner to just be less critical, you think you're asking them to drop a heavy suitcase. But mechanically, you're asking them to dismantle their own skeleton while they're standing up.
And from their internal perspective, your request sounds absurd. This is where we run into what Starr calls the illusion of accuracy.
Oh, right. Because from the outside, a person locked in this evaluative architecture looks rigid or trapped or even compulsive.
But from the inside, it doesn't feel like a compulsion at all. It feels like clarity. It feels like upholding rigorous standards in a world where everyone else is being sloppy.
Because the brain is incredibly good at justifying its own survival mechanisms, the system is doing this to prevent identity collapse, but it masks that desperation with a feeling of superiority.
It tells the host, you aren't doing this because you're terrified of losing yourself. You're doing this because you are highly perceptive and incredibly accurate.
Which means the system is not malfunctioning.
No. That is the hardest conceptual leap Starr asks us to make here.
Yeah, because we really want to pathologize this behavior. We want to say the judgmental mind is broken or toxic.
But structurally, it is adapted to produce internal stability. And it is succeeding brilliantly at that task. The architecture is performing exactly as designed.
It's succeeding wildly, sure, but the structural cost of that success is just staggering.
It is.
Let's look at how this changes the physical way a mind digests its information. Once evaluation becomes that primary load-bearing pillar, the brain alters its processing filter, right?
Yes, it comes down to information metabolization.
Metabolization, like digesting food.
Exactly like that.
Yeah.
If a biological system encounters a complex protein, it doesn't have the enzymes to break down what happens. It rejects it.
Right.
The psychological architecture works the exact same way. If incoming data cannot be rapidly assigned a verdict, if it's ambiguous or contradictory or just highly complex, the system physically cannot metabolize it.
Because it can't be quickly positioned as good or bad relative to the self.
Exactly. So it is simply rejected.
So what looks like standard issue closed-mindedness to the rest of us is actually just the system spitting out data it has no efficient way to process.
Yes. You could present this person with a highly nuanced socioeconomic study or, a deeply ambiguous piece of art, and they will dismiss it instantly.
Not because they lack the intelligence to parse it.
No, they might be brilliant. But engaging with ambiguity slows down the verdict machine. And slowing down the verdict machine risks identity destabilization.
Which is a perfect segue into how sustained evaluation physically reorganizes perception over time.
Right, because a sustained evaluative stance isn't just a pattern of thought. It acts as a permanent perceptual filter.
STAR uses a great analogy here, or rather, it inspired a way of thinking about it for me, the copy editor mode.
Oh yes, break that down.
Imagine you are a professional copy editor and someone hands you a sweeping, emotionally devastating, beautifully written novel, but you are locked completely into your professional evaluative mode.
Your red pen is out.
Your red pen is out. And as you read, the only things your eyes actually focus on are the misplaced commas, the dangling modifiers, the formatting errors. You are physically looking at the same pages as anyone else, but your perceptual machinery is entirely optimized for finding typographical errors.
You literally cannot perceive the beauty of the prose or the depth of the characters.
Exactly. That analogy captures the attention allocation perfectly. The brain eventually becomes incapable of processing any experience that doesn't fall into the category of an error to be assessed.
And it's not that the person chooses to ignore the beauty. Their neural pathways have been pruned to such an extent that the beauty just does not register. It is filtered out before it even reaches conscious awareness.
Which leads to a severe physiological consequence. Starr argues that when you are locked in this copy editor mode, scanning only for deviations, you fundamentally lose access to a very specific class of experiences.
Right. Awe, genuine curiosity, and surprise.
And I really want to pause here, because usually when we talk about awe or curiosity, we treat them as these nice, decorative, poetic states. We talk about the luxury of feeling awe while looking at the Grand Canyon.
I think it's a nice bonus to the human experience.
Right. But in the framework of psychological architecture, awe and surprise are not decorative at all. They are strictly mechanical requirements.
They are. They are the primary biological mechanisms by which a psychological system updates its own organization.
This blew my mind when I read it. Think about how a computer system updates. It has to briefly suspend its normal operations, right? You have to restart the machine to install the new software.
Yes, there has to be downtime.
Starr is saying that awe and surprise literally are that installation process for the human psyche.
To understand why, we have to look at how humans actually learn. True structural learning isn't just taking a new fact and filing it into your existing folder.
That's merely accumulation, right?
Right. Real structural updating, what cognitive psychologists might call accommodation, requires reorganizing the folders themselves. You have to break down your existing categories and build new ones.
And the only way the brain is motivated to burn the massive amount of calories required to break down and rebuild its folders is if it gets hit with an experience that its current folders absolutely cannot contain.
Exactly. And that's what awe is. That's what genuine surprise is. It's an encounter with something so vast or so completely outside your paradigm that the system throws its hands up and says, wait, this doesn't fit anywhere. I have to rebuild the architecture to make room for this.
But if your evaluation system is permanently locked on, the channel through which that revision occurs is firmly bolted shut.
It is blocked completely. The moment an awe-inspiring or surprising piece of data arrives, the evaluative machine instantly attacks it.
It chops it up, forces a rapid premature verdict on it, and just shoves it into a pre-existing folder.
Yeah. The Grand Canyon isn't a vast perspective-shattering encounter. It's just, it's a bit too crowded today.
Or a complex piece of abstract art isn't an invitation to reorganize your aesthetic understanding. It's just pretentious garbage.
The system is never overwhelmed. It never allows itself to be pushed into that vulnerable state of suspension where a reset can happen.
And by avoiding that overwhelm, it stabilizes itself, but it violently reduces its own plasticity, which brings us right back to our diagnostic anchor.
The system becomes increasingly coherent by becoming increasingly difficult to update.
It's incredibly stable, but completely impervious to being changed by the world.
And this creates what Starr identifies as one of the most profound analytical tensions in the essay. The widening gap between the world becoming more legible and the world becoming more meaningful.
I found this to be the most quietly devastating insight of the entire piece. We tend to conflate those two concepts constantly. We think that if we understand something, it means something to us.
But evaluation is a tool designed entirely for legibility. It exists to categorize, define, label, and assess.
You look at a chaotic political situation or, a messy family dynamic, and you judge it. You assign blame, you figure out who is right and who is wrong, and suddenly you understand where everything fits.
The situation is now highly legible. You've mapped it.
But legibility does not generate meaning. You don't produce deep, resonant meaning in your life by successfully categorizing everything as correct or flawed.
No, because meaning doesn't come from assessment. It comes from encounter. It comes from making contact with something that matters on its own terms, not just as an object you are judging.
You used a great analogy when we were prepping for this, the mismanaged corporate structure versus a dynamic creative startup.
Right, yeah. You can have an organization where every single employee's micro movements are tracked, every workflow is rigidly defined, and every output is constantly evaluated.
A perfectly legible system.
Exactly. The managers know exactly what is happening at all times, but the work itself is entirely devoid of meaning, passion, or innovation. It's dead.
And the startup?
The startup might be messier and vastly less legible, but the encounters between the people produce profound, meaningful work.
So if your internal architecture is entirely evaluative, you end up living a life where everything makes perfect sense. Your mental desk is flawlessly organized.
Everyone you know has been neatly categorized into boxes of useful, annoying, smart, or foolish.
You have figured the world out. It is 100% legible, but it is completely hollow. You have traded meaning for legibility.
And Starr notes that the gap between these two states widens very quietly over time. The person rarely notices the loss of meaning because they are so constantly flooded with the dopamine hits of achieving legibility.
They feel sharp, they feel smart, they feel organized,
Exactly.
which is terrifying because it means the system doesn't just stay static, it escalates. And Starr uses a phrase here that is chilling in its mechanical precision, the habituation of judgment.
Habituation. It operates precisely like building a physiological tolerance to a stimulant.
Walk us through that mechanism.
Whoa. When the psychological architecture first begins relying on evaluation to stabilize the identity, a simple, everyday verdict might provide a strong feeling of internal clarity.
Like saying, I didn't like that movie.
Right. Boom. The identity feels solid. But over time, the brain habituates to that baseline level of resolution. The internal clarity diminishes.
So to get that same feeling of structural stability, the system requires a larger dose.
Yes. The distinctions have to become sharper. The verdicts have to become more extreme. I didn't like that movie. No longer provides enough stabilizing force.
It has to become, that movie is an objective failure, and anyone who enjoys it is intellectually bankrupt.
Yes. And this demand for sharper, faster verdicts leads to a structural necessity, the discarding of nuance.
Now, culturally, when someone consistently rejects nuance, we assume they are dogmatic or uneducated or just intellectually lazy.
But Starr points out that from an architectural standpoint, nuance isn't rejected out of hatred or ignorance. It is discarded because it is cognitively inefficient.
Let's really look at the mechanics of that. Holding a nuanced position requires maintaining contradictory truths simultaneously, right?
Right. It requires seeing the validity in opposing sides, acknowledging gray areas, and sitting in ambiguity.
And from a neurological standpoint, maintaining cognitive dissonance, holding those conflicting truths without resolving them, burns a massive amount of metabolic energy.
Exactly. Nuance requires the middle of the distribution. But if your psychological architecture requires a rapid, definitive verdict in order to keep your identity from collapsing, nuance is completely useless to you.
Because it doesn't yield a verdict fast enough.
It doesn't. The system simply cannot afford the cognitive load of sitting in the gray area, so it aggressively deletes the middle of the distribution. Everything is pushed to the binary poles, good or bad, right or wrong, friend or enemy.
It's collapsing the middle not as a moral failing, but as a desperate drive for processing efficiency. But if we follow that logic, I think we hit a real analytical tension here.
Oh, definitely. The brittleness problem.
Yes. Starr talks about this heavily optimized system becoming increasingly brittle over time. But we just established that from the inside, the person feels incredibly confident, incredibly sharp, and highly stable.
Yeah.
How can an architecture that experiences itself as decisive and precise actually be structurally brittle?
We have to look at how different systems handle complex stress. Instead of the cliché idea of a rigid crystal shattering, let's look at this through the lens of information processing, like a highly optimized legacy computer operating system.
Okay, I like that. Let's dig into the legacy system.
Imagine a massive mainframe built in the 1980s for a very specific banking function. For decades, it has been aggressively optimized to do one single thing: process simple arithmetic transactions at lightning speed.
So it is confident, it is flawless at its job, and it feels incredibly stable.
Exactly. But its code is rigid. It is zero plasticity.
So what happens when you try to plug a modern USB drive into it or ask it to process a complex, dynamic piece of open source software?
It doesn't just run the new software slowly. It physically cannot recognize the input. The architecture is so hyper-specialized, and the pathways are so deeply entrenched that the introduction of complex, uncategorizable data causes a fatal error.
It crashes.
It crashes entirely. Contrast that with a modern dynamic operating system. A modern system might experience a slight lag while it searches for the right drivers to understand the new USB device.
It has to pause, suspend its normal operations, and adapt. It has plasticity.
That makes perfect sense. The evaluative system is the legacy mainframe. Its map of the world has been so simplified and the middle so entirely collapsed that it cannot deform or adapt to accommodate messy, chaotic human complexity.
So when it encounters a life event that absolutely refuses to be quickly categorized, a complex grief, a sudden illness, a nuanced betrayal, the system doesn't adapt.
It snaps. That is structural brittleness, completely masked by a subjective feeling of supreme, fast-processing confidence.
And that brittleness bleeds directly into the chilling social consequences of this architecture. Starr explores this under the concept of functional isolation.
Right. We are looking at what happens to human relationships when a rigid legacy mainframe tries to interact with dynamic, complex human beings.
As the evaluative stance intensifies and escalates, the system fundamentally changes how it processes other people.
The deep subjectivity of another human being, their inner life, their contradictory motivations, their messy emotional reality becomes progressively less relevant to the task the evaluative system is performing.
And we have to keep in mind the system's primary task here.
Yeah.
Rapid assessment to maintain identity stability.
Exactly. Other people's deep interiority is wildly inefficient data. It's too nuanced. It slows down the verdict machine. So the architecture simply stops consulting it.
This is crucial to clarify for everyone listening. The person isn't making a conscious philosophical choice that other people don't matter. It's not clinical sociopathy or a lack of empathy on a moral level.
No, it's that the cognitive architecture is no longer structured to require that information as an input. Think of it structurally. Other people transition from being subjects to be encountered into objects to be assessed.
The paradox here is wild when you see it in real life. You can sit across the dinner table from someone operating in this architecture. They are highly verbally fluent.
They are socially active. They make eye contact.
Right. They are debating the news, laughing at a joke, fully present in the room. There are no external markers of withdrawal. And yet structurally, they are physically incapable of making actual human contact.
They are present, but they are not in contact. They are taking in your statements, your tone of voice, your physical characteristics, and your flaws, but they are processing all of that as a data set.
Their evaluative machine is rapidly running that data to produce verdicts about you.
Which in turn keeps their own identity stable. You are not a person they are meeting. You are raw material fueling their internal factory.
They are functionally isolated in plain sight. And this brings all of these separate mechanisms, the loss of the off switch, the scanning for deviation, the closing of the revision channel, the discarding of nuance, the functional isolation together into one terrifying, unified theory.
These aren't just random side effects. They form a single, self-sealing mechanical loop.
This is where Starr elevates the essay from a descriptive account into a robust explanatory model. He maps out how the system literally feeds on itself to survive.
Yes. If we trace the sequence, the mechanics of this psychological Ouroboros become undeniably clear.
Let's trace it. It starts with the perceptual filter, right? The continuous demand for evaluation narrows perception. You enter that copy editor mode where you only see the deviations, the flaws, the things to be judged.
Right. And because you only see deviations, your identity naturally consolidates around what remains visible. You begin to define yourself exclusively as the standard bearer, the one who spots the errors that everyone else misses.
Because the identity is now entirely consolidated around that action, the system increases its reliance on evaluation. It needs to evaluate more often and more aggressively just to keep the identity stable.
Which triggers the habituation we discussed. The increased reliance escalates the pressure. You build a tolerance, so you need sharper, harsher verdicts to get the same hit of stability.
And this escalation further reduces your receptivity. You literally have less cognitive bandwidth for awe or surprise because your processor is maxed out rapidly assessing threats and flaws.
And without the capacity for awe or surprise, the revision channel closes completely. The system permanently loses its plasticity. It can no longer learn or update.
And finally, because the revision channel is closed, because the system can no longer find stability through growth, learning, or encountering the new, it is forced to rely even more heavily on rapid evaluation as its only remaining source of identity stabilization.
The loop closes, begins again, and pulls tighter and more rigid with every cycle.
It's an incredibly tight, sealed circuit. And understanding this loop explains a phenomenon I think almost everyone listening has experienced at some point. Why trying to argue with or confront someone locked in this state is a complete and utter waste of time.
It perfectly explains the failure of external pressure. When you confront someone trapped in this architecture, you naturally expect your pressure to crack their shell.
Let's say you're in a family therapy session. You bring logical counterexamples to their rigid worldviews, or you offer a tearful, highly emotional confrontation saying, your constant judgments are destroying our relationship.
You think you are introducing an anomaly that will force the system to pause and reflect. You think you are handing them a piece of data so emotionally potent that they will have to update their software.
But the architecture doesn't perceive your confrontation as an existential threat to its worldview.
No, it perceives your emotional plea or your logical counterargument as fresh raw material for the factory. It's just new data to evaluate.
The system eats the disruption.
It does. It processes your tearful confrontation and instantly issues a verdict. They're being overly emotional and irrational. This proves my superiority.
Or you present a flawless logical counterexample, and the system immediately scans it for a microflaw to dismiss it. Their premise is based on a biased source.
The system uses your attempt to disrupt it as further evidence of its own incredible clarity. It metabolizes the confrontation and turns it into structural reinforcement.
The more you push, the more data you give the verdict machine to process, which only makes the system feel more stable. It is structurally self-sealing.
Mechanically flawless, but deeply haunting.
You cannot break the machine by feeding it exactly what it was designed to process, which forces us to step back and look at what this system achieves versus what it cannot do. And we really need to maintain STAR's strict, non-judgmental tone here.
Absolutely. We have to honor the architecture's success. This system is not a failure.
Far from it. It is highly optimized for a specific set of functions, and its functional victories are profound.
The first is clarity. The continuous evaluative stance produces a highly interpretable world.
Right. There's no agonizing over moral gray areas. Situations resolve quickly. Positions are hyperstable.
In a world defined by chaos and ambiguity, achieving that level of cognitive clarity is a massive psychological achievement.
The second victory is speed. Evaluative systems are blazingly efficient.
Because they do not tolerate ambiguity and they don't waste caloric energy pausing for receptivity or awe, they can process massive amounts of experience incredibly fast and return an immediate output.
In a high-stakes corporate environment or in an emergency, this rigid architecture often looks like sheer, unparalleled competence.
And the third, and undoubtedly most important victory, is identity stability. For this person, the self does not collapse under pressure.
There is no persistent, agonizing uncertainty about who they are or what they believe.
As Starr points out, we should not dismiss the immense value of this. Millions of people live in absolute distress because their sense of self is fluid, collapsing, or unanchored. The evaluative architecture completely, permanently solves the problem of an unstable self.
It solves it perfectly. But the real cost, the tragic cost, is what happens while it is succeeding. We have to contrast these massive achievements with the absolute limitations of the architecture.
Because while this person moves through time, they age, they change careers, they get married, they have children, their underlying structure cannot change.
The revision channel is bolted shut. They are accumulating years, but they are not accumulating structural growth.
And they can never access genuine reciprocity. As we mapped out earlier, if others are objects to be assessed rather than subjects to be encountered, true relational reciprocity is mechanically impossible.
They live in a world that is clearly hierarchized, rapidly processed, intensely stable, and profoundly deeply thin.
Starr writes, the interpretability and the thinness are not contradictions. They're produced by the same architecture.
That reframes the entire tragedy of this condition. The tragedy is not that the psychological system breaks down. The tragedy is that it works perfectly.
It executes exactly what it was built to do, flawlessly, forever, at the absolute cost of the person ever truly being touched by the world again.
Which brings us to the final structural conclusion of Starr's work. We have to address the idea of change or intervention, because when we see someone caught in this loop, living in this thin, highly legible world, our natural instinct is to assume they just need to change their mind.
The common misconception is that it's an intention problem. We think, If they just decided to be less critical, if they just had a daily intention to be more open-minded, they could fix this.
But Starr firmly establishes that intention is entirely irrelevant here.
Because it is fundamentally a reorganization problem. The architecture of the self has structurally altered how it processes reality. Asking this system to just choose to be open-minded is structurally impossible.
If we go back to our technology metaphor, it's like asking that legacy mainframe to just decide to run a modern AI script because it would be more helpful.
Right. The physical pathways for that process do not exist. The hardware is fundamentally incompatible with the request.
So if there is a path out, if the hard rebuilding is actually going to happen, it isn't about making better choices in the heat of the moment. It is about agonizingly, slowly rebuilding the closed channels from the ground up.
Reorganization at the level of structure does not happen through a single decision or a moment of realization. It happens through the slow, highly uncomfortable, effortful rebuilding of the revision channel.
It means deliberately putting the system in positions where rapid evaluation is actively thwarted, forcing the receptivity channel to slowly, painfully pry back open.
It means retraining the capacity for genuine encounter. It means sitting across from another human being and forcing yourself to absorb their messy, contradictory reality without immediately processing them for data or issuing a verdict.
It is an entirely different order of work than simply choosing to be less judgmental. It is the architectural renovation of the psyche.
It requires enduring the very thing the system was built to avoid, the terrifying, destabilizing feeling of not knowing exactly where you or the world stand.
And that leaves us with a final thought to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. As you go through your week, as you process the news, as you sit in meetings, as you talk to your partner or your kids, pay attention to how quickly you arrive at certainty.
If you find yourself in a space where you are never confused, where every new piece of information perfectly validates your existing worldview,
where every person's behavior is instantly legible to you and you immediately know exactly which mental box to drop them into,
it raises the ultimate diagnostic question.
Are you experiencing profound earned clarity? Or are you simply living inside an architecture that has successfully eliminated its own capacity to be surprised by the world?
Are you actually seeing the room, or have you just replaced your eye with a flashlight?
Think about it. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by R.J. Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.